Hello and welcome to Narayana IAS DNA live session. Students, in today's DNA session, we are going to focus on three most important topics from the Hindu and the Indian Express. Trust me students, once you go through these topics, you will have a good hold over the topics that we are discussing in today's session. Students, whenever you are watching the DNA live session, make sure that you are taking the notes, taking down the notes. Make sure that once the DNA session ends, make sure that you are rehearsing what's been told and taught in the DNA live session. By doing this exercise, you'll make sure that the concepts that you have learned in the DNA session will be ingrained in your mind. And this will help you in your UPSC mains examination especially. So always have this habit of writing, because writing is very important for your UPSC mains examination. So always cultivate this habit of writing whatever you learn, so that you develop this practice of writing, rehearsing, writing, and then producing it in the examination, right? So the three topics that we'll be discussing is first about the economic growth in our country, especially the K-shaped growth, which means the rich are getting more richer and the smaller businesses relatively are growing only marginally, right? The second article talks about the United Nations Security Council reforms. Here we'll understand the demands why the different nations, right, especially the countries from the global south, or so-called the developing and the poor nations, are demanding that reforms in the UNSA or United Nations Security Council is must to address the global realities of the 21st century. The third topic talks about the sponge city concept. Now, given that the urban centers or urban cities face numerous challenges with respect to waterlogging issue or the water crisis issue, how this sponge city concept will come to the rescue of the urban centers or urban cities of our country is something that we are going to understand in the third topic. So these are the three topics that we will be discussing. Let's start with the first topic. What is the title of the first topic? Is India's growth story benefiting only big capital? We all know that India is growing, right? Especially among all the major economies, India's economy is really doing well, is growing significantly. But the question is it only benefiting the wealthier section of the society? That is the big businesses, is something that we'll be understanding in today's first topic, right? So, what we'll be understanding is the economic growth, especially the inclusive growth, and how it is important to address the major challenges of our country, right? And you can mark this for prelims as well as mains, GS paper 3, Indian economy, and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth and development, right? Now, what is the context? We know that the Indian economy is growing significantly and has grown remarkably well. If you look at the number in the year 23-24, the Indian economy grew at the rate of 8.2 percentage. And this 8.2 percentage is actually the highest among all the developing or the major economies in the world. Now, this number actually makes every Indian swell with pride, right? Why? Because India is growing at 8.3 percentage, right? But despite the achievement of growing at 8.3 percentage and being the highest among the major economies, the concern is that whether this growth is getting confined only to a narrow section of the society, that is the big businesses and the wealthier section of the society. This is a concern. We all know that, we have read many times that the rich people are getting richer, the poor people are getting more poorer, right? So this is a concern that the experts have pointed out to. And there's a growing perception that the benefits of economic growth, they are only confined to a certain section of the society, right? And that's the reason the authors or the experts have pointed out that inclusive growth is very, very important, right? Just by ensuring or by making sure that the wealthier section are getting benefited or benefiting out of the economic growth is not going to help our country in addressing some of the fundamental challenges our country is facing, be it poverty or in the health sector or with respect to security of our country. And that's the reason we have to make sure, the government of India has to make sure that the growth of a country is evenly distributed across a population and is not confined only to a narrow section. I hope you understood the context. Now let us try to understand which are the reasons due to which these smaller businesses of our country are not benefiting of the economic growth that India is witnessing. Which are the challenges, or what is it that these smaller businesses are not in a position to take benefit? Let's try to understand each and every dimension, right? So now let us try to understand the disparity in economic growth, right? Now the World Bank and the NSO, that is National Statistical Office, these two organizations have noted a K-shaped growth, a K-shaped recovery. What does it mean? This is K-shaped, which means that the larger businesses, the big businesses have thrived. Which are the big businesses? For example, the one who are a part of technology, right? Technology related company, or for that matter, the companies in the financial sector, pharmaceuticals, real estate. So these people are benefiting. K-shaped, which means if you see, this is projecting upwards, which means this section is growing. That is, the big businesses are thriving. But the bottom 50% of the population, they are seeing minimal growth. This section, they are seeing minimal growth, which means these institutions have noted that India is experiencing K-shaped growth, which means the businesses are thriving at a brisk pace, at a fast pace, but the smaller, the MSME or the SME. What is MSME? Micro, small and medium enterprises. Micro, small and medium enterprises. And this is SME, MSME, right? Small, medium enterprises. So these companies, the MSMEs or these small businesses, they are witnessing gradual growth or minimal growth as compared to the big businesses. This is K-shaped growth. Now you need to understand what is K-shaped growth. I hope you understood what is K-shaped growth. Now the question can also be asked in the prelims. The K-shaped growth in the economy refers to which of the following options? Then you need to select the correct option. I hope you understood what do you mean by K-shaped growth. The second, impact on the SMEs. Now, according to Ministry of MSME, more than 60% of the small businesses reported losses during the pandemic, and they are still in the phase of recovery. See, all this statistics is very, very important to mention in the mains examination. So whenever you write answers in the mains examination, make sure that you are trying to include as many dimensions as possible with the inclusion of facts and data, or let's say the Supreme Court observation, the reports of the committees, etc. By maintaining diversity in your mains answer, you ensure that you fetch more number of marks than your competitors. Students, even 0.5 marks every mark counts in the examination. So make sure that you are hungry to earn one extra mark than your competitors, because every single mark makes a huge difference, right? And by including such facts in your mains answer, you are bound to get those 0.5 or 1 marks extra than your competitors, which will help you to get good score in the mains examination, right? So this MSME ministry has observed that more than 60% have suffered losses during the pandemic and still are in the phase of recovery. And what is the reason? What is the reason that the small businesses are facing loss? The high compliance cost and the limited access to affordable capital. Now, what is this compliance cost? We'll understand in the next slide. Till that time, let's understand the third one. Now, data from the Ministry of Finance shows that effective corporate tax rate for large corporations dropped to around 22%, which means the corporate tax was slashed, right? So, yeah. So, now in the year 2019, the corporate tax was slashed from 30% to 20%, right? It's written 22% here. Why? Because if you include the surcharge and cess, the 20% was increased to further 22%, right? You might wonder, why is it that the government reduced the corporate tax? Let me just try to help you with an example so that you understand the benefits of reducing tax. Okay. Let's say, for example, an individual has a net worth of, let's say, 10 LP. And for 10 LPA or against 10 LPA, he is paying like 2.5 lakhs as taxes. Which means out of 10 lakhs which he earns annually, 2.5 lakh rupees he gives it to the government as a part of tax. Which means whatever expenditure he does, he can spend out of 7.5 lakhs, not out of 10 lakhs, right? Because 2.5 lakhs he has given to the government, right? Which means of the limited resource, that is 7.5 lakh rupees, he has to spend on whichever needs he wants to satisfy or meet. Now, let's say, for example, this person has, let's say, 4 children, which means this person will face difficulty in educating or providing quality education, healthcare. Now, let's assume that out of 4 children, this person who is earning 10 LPA can afford to give education to only 2 children, which means the other 2 children is not in a position to give education, affordable education or quality education. Which means the chances of these 2 children who got the education, the chances of these 2 children who got education will be more with respect to employability, which means they would have a good chance to seek meaningful employment, right? And these 2 children might face or might find it difficult to find meaningful employment. Now, had this person, let's say, for example, the government completely waives off the tax, or let's say the government tells this person to only pay 50,000 as taxes, which means now he would have 9.5 lakh rupees to spend. He will be in a position to give education to all his 4 children, which means all these 4 children would have maximum chance to seek meaningful employment. Now, when you get employment, right, you get money, you earn money. When you earn money, you spend money. This is how an economy functions. Demand, there is a demand, so there will be supply, right? Then more people will demand. Demand, supply, demand, supply. This is how the economy functions. And that's the reason the government focuses on providing employment. Why? Because when you are employed, you earn money. When you earn money, you spend, which means you create demand in the market. When there's more demand in the market, there will be more supply, which means more employment. This is how economy grows. Talking about the business, as I told you, in the year 2019, the corporate tax was slashed from 30% to 22%, 20%, but including the surcharge and cess, it increased to 22%. Which means now, let's say for example, a company whose net profit is 100 crores would have to pay 22 crores as taxes. First, until 2019, 30 crores. Which means now they have more money at their disposal to invest in infrastructure, technology, or expansion of business. Right? So, which means as the companies have more money, the companies would expand their business. And when they're expanding the business, they're actually providing employment to more number of people. The cycle repeats. More employment, more earning, more expenditure, more demand, more supply. This is how economy grows. That's the reason the government slashed it. But somehow, the next point, the small and medium enterprises still face an effective tax rate of approximately 26%. Now, whenever we file ITR, we try to reduce our tax liability, right? So, those who earn and those who file ITR would know that they would, or the people who earn would try to reduce their tax liability by showing deductions and exemptions. They would try to avail as many exemptions the government provides, and they would try to make full advantage of the deductions the government provides. Now, as the larger companies are in a better position because of the resources, because of the professionals they hire, they are in a better position to maximize the deductions and exemptions. That's the reason the net tax they pay compared to the small businesses in terms of percentage is less. To put it simply, let's say for example, if a business is earning 10 crores, right, which means you would pay like, or let's say 1 crore, which means you would pay close to 22 lakhs as taxes, 22%. But if a small company is earning 10 lakhs, right, effectively he pays 26 lakhs, which is more than the 22%. Why? Because of the shortage of resources, dearth of resources, the tax burden on the smaller companies is more. This is the reason why we see that the big companies are able to, or the big companies were in a position to maximize this tax cut than the smaller companies, right? So, moving on. Okay, so now talking about the structural challenges, the compliance burden. As we discussed that the smaller companies are burdened with compliance. What does it mean? What do you mean by compliance? Which means the government, right? The government of India frames certain rules and regulations, and every company have to abide by those rules and regulations, right? For example, every company has to file GST. right? Every company has to maintain records. The companies who are supposed to buy licenses, they have to buy licenses. Now, in order to adhere to this compliance or regulation by the government of India, the companies would need professionals, which means they need to hire more people. But again, if you compare the big companies and the small companies, the big companies, due to the profits or due to the large capital, are in a position to hire more number of people, thereby adhering to the government regulations. But the smaller companies, because of the dearth of capital, shortage of capital, are not in a position to adhere to all the compliances or rules and regulation of the government of India, which means the compliance burden on the companies is more. The smaller companies, so to say. This is what we understand by the compliance burden. Next is cost of capital. So, students, just to make you understand, these are some of the problems due to which we see that the bigger companies are growing exponentially compared to the smaller companies, right? Next is cost of capital. What is cost of capital? Cost of capital is nothing but the interest rate, right? So, according to the RBI, the average lending rate, who lends? The lenders, the financial institutions like the banks, right? The lending rate for SMEs stands at 12 to 14% compared to 8 to 9% for large corporations. Which means, let's say for example, this is a large company and this is a small company. If this large company takes a loan of 100 crore, the lending rate, the interest rate would be only 8 to 9%. But for the smaller company, it would be 12 to 14%. You might wonder, why is it so? See, whenever a lender lends money to a company, please focus this. Try to understand this concept. Whenever a lender lends money or gives loan to a company, he checks the credit worthiness of that company. Which means, whenever the lender lends money to the company, the lender would check if the company is in a position to pay back the amount. Now, given the credit worthiness of the bigger companies, which is more strong, the lenders are comfortable lending the amount to the big companies compared to smaller companies. Are you getting my point? Which means, for example, the larger companies, they have huge resource, big capital. The businesses are not only pan country but pan world, which means the lenders know that given the size of the company, if not now, in the future would be in a position to pay back the amount. And the big companies also have the collaterals. They have the assets that they can mortgage to avail loan. But the smaller companies, they are not in the position, the credit worthiness of the smaller companies is not as strong as the bigger companies. Are you getting my point? So this is another problem, which means access to capital is a problem for these smaller companies. The next is taxation issues. The Central Board of Direct Taxes has noted that while the nominal tax rate for smaller firms is low on paper, the actual tax burden due to fewer deductions and exemptions. This is what I explained in the previous slide. Because the smaller companies are not in a position to maximize deductions and exemptions, they pay more in terms of percentage than the larger companies or big businesses. So this is another problem. Next, Niti Aayog and IMF have reported that the implementation of GST and demonetization disproportionately affected the unorganized sector. Now, unorganized sector is the sector that employs around 85 to 90% of the workforce. Right. So because of the GST and the implementation of the demonetization, the unorganized sector suffered a great. Talking about the infrastructure spending, the economic survey indicated that 35% of the capital expenditure is directed towards infrastructure projects, which only benefits the capital intensive sectors like the steel and construction companies, but does not. Why? Because see, this capital, the lenders would prefer to lend to the capital intensive companies or the companies that has a potential to generate a huge revenue. Now, infrastructure is that sector which has a potential to reap rich dividends, and that's the reason the lenders prefer to pay or lend money to such companies. The capital expenditure is directed more towards the infrastructure projects which benefits the capital intensive industry. This is another point to be noted. Now, these are some of the problems that we have discussed, right? Because of which, or the reason why we see the big businesses growing exponentially, and compared to the big businesses, the smaller businesses are seeing marginal growth. What is the reason? We discussed 5 to 6 problems, right? Now, recommendations. Now, the experts have recommended certain solutions, certain measures through which we can actually put a break to this divide, right? So, now the MSME Ministry's annual report suggests that simplifying compliance requirement. Now the compliance requirement, right? The compliance requirement cannot be the same for the big companies and the smaller companies. Let's say, for example, if I talk about data storage. Now let us say that a giant company like Facebook. These companies are technology related companies, and let's say there's a startup. Now, the company mandates that the digital companies have to store the data in the country. Now, in order to store the data, you need to have that infrastructure, you need to have the capital to invest in the resource or in the servers to store the data. But these startups, now this big companies, giant companies, they have huge capital, so are in a position to adhere to the regulations framed by the government. But these startups are not in a position to invest money in buying servers to store the data. Why? Because these startups, they would try to spend or expenditure more and more on the business expansion, on investment, technology, innovation. And that's the reason the experts have suggested that the compliance burden on these smaller businesses should be reduced. Then, taxation reforms, a report by the 15th Finance Commission recommends more equitable taxation system and suggested targeted tax benefits, right? The tax benefits have to be structured in a way that should benefit the smaller companies as well as the big businesses, but making sure that the challenges or the hurdles, difficulties these smaller companies face is also taken into account, and therefore the tax structure should be structured accordingly. Transitioning from asset based to cash flow based lending. Now, this term is very, very important. These are the terms that you have to mention in your mains answer. What is the term? Transitioning from asset based to cash flow. Asset based, for example, let's say I am a lender. There are two companies that I want to lend. So I'll think which company I want to lend my money. Now, this company A is a big company, is a giant company. There are lots of assets, not only in one country, but in many countries. And then there's company B. They do not have assets and their business is only confined to one country. Now here the lenders like me as a lender, I'll prefer to invest or provide loan to this company A. Why? Because they have assets, which means they can mortgage their assets, but these smaller companies cannot. And that's the reason the experts are suggesting that we need to move from asset based to cash flow, which means the lenders should also take into consideration the growth potential of the startups. Let's say, for example, this company B has a huge potential to grow and expand, which means the government has to set certain guidelines and rules and regulations, thereby helping these smaller businesses avail credit or capital. This is the third suggestion. The NSSO, right, has found that rural distress is high with agriculture income stagnating. And so, increase investment in rural infrastructure, that is to help the farmers with respect to, let's say, solar pumps, right? And agriculture productivity could help revitalize the rural economy, right? So here the government has to focus on revitalizing the rural economy by focusing or by investing in the rural infrastructure, thereby helping the MSME industries, right? Long-term implication. The economic survey cautions that growth driven primarily by large corporations and infrastructure spending is not sustainable, which means here the author tries to suggest that such type of growth, the K-shaped growth, is not beneficial for long term, right? Which means it is to suggest that the government has to rethink their policies and ensure that the smaller companies are also benefiting and they are also in a position to expand their business, thereby employing more number of people and seeing economic growth. And most importantly, to ensure that the MSME industry is growing, political will is extremely important, which means the political class has to ensure that they are catering to the demands of the MSME sector or MSME industry, right? Now, see, whenever you are writing an answer, make sure, as I told you, try to add as many points or as many dimensions as possible. So, with respect to the concern that we discussed the reasons why we are witnessing a K-shaped growth. Second, we discussed the suggestions that the government of India should take into consideration. Now, here we also need to think as in what the government of India has done in order to help the MSME industries. So, these are some of the schemes that you can or you should mention in the examination. For example, the first one is the Credit Guarantee Fund for MSME. The purpose is to provide collateral free credit, which means without mortgaging their assets, the MSME industries should be in a position to avail loan, right? The second, the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, now to provide loans up to 10 lakh, right? To 10 lakh to non-corporate, not to the big businesses, to non-corporate sector. For this, the loans are categorized under three segments. One is Shishu, Kishore, and the third one is Tarun. So please try to remember such points because exam or a question in the prelims can be asked on such points, right? Udyam registration to simplify the registration process for the MSME sector to bring more units into the formal sector, which means here the government by this scheme intends to formalize the economy, which means bring as many people as possible into the formal sector. Now, what is the advantage of being a part of the formal sector? Which means you get pension, you get insurance scheme, you will be part of the insurance scheme, which means, let's say for example, if you fall ill, let's say for example, a person is working in the informal sector, he falls ill, he gets admitted to a hospital, which means all the money that he has saved, a substantial amount of that he has to spend it to meet the hospital expenditure. Now, if you are part of the formal sector, which means here you have insurance scheme, thereby the insurance company will pay money on your behalf for the premium that you pay every year, which is marginal compared to the hospital cost that you would incur. And that next is the digital MSME scheme. The purpose is to adopt information and communication technology, that is to adopt technology. Here the government is focusing that the MSME companies should adopt the technology, right? And which means, see, if the company adopts technology, their business will be more efficient, right? As their business will be more efficient, they would earn more money. As they'll earn more money, they'll expand their business, they'll employ more people, and this is how they'll contribute in the economic growth of the nation, right? So these are the schemes that you can mention in the examination, and finally in the conclusion you can mention that here the government of India has to ensure that the challenges of the MSME sector is taken into consideration, right, and ensuring that our country experiences equitable growth, inclusive growth, so that the people from every section are benefiting out of the economic growth of our nation, right? So this is about the first topic. I hope students you have understood each and every dimension that we have discussed in the first topic. Now here are a few questions. Let me just take these questions, right? Uh, the question is, K-shaped recovery comes after recession, right? Exactly. Yes, Sunil Kumar. Did India experience a recession? No, India did not experience a recession, but the economic condition of India during the pandemic, right? It sort of contracted India's economy, right? So this is the reason why we discussed that the MSME sector, MSME industry is trying to still recover from the losses made during the pandemic. Why MSME got losses during COVID but not? See, the big companies, as I told you, they have big capital. They have a huge capital at their disposal. Which means, let's say, for example, a poor person and a rich person, right? Let's say, for example, a rich person has 1 crore in his bank account. A poor person has, let's say, only 5 lakh. Now, during pandemic, when people lose jobs, this person who just has 5 lakh rupees will exhaust all his saving. But this person who has 1 crore, who is a rich person, has a huge capital, thereby his life can be sustained. Right, Sunil? Okay. So, are we a rich country or a poor country? Now, if you talk about the number, right, the GDP, no doubt India is a rich country. But if you talk in the PPP terms, then you might say that India is not a wealthy nation, but however, India is a growing economy. So this is not a black and, you cannot expect a black and white answer for such type of question, right? So India is a growing economy. This is what you need to bear in your mind. So this is about the first topic. Let's move on to the next topic. So here the admissions are open for the 25-26 academic year. Those who are interested to start their UPSC preparation, make sure you enroll, right? These are the centers: Hyderabad, Vijayawada, Nellore. Wherever you belong, you can avail one of the best facilities in the entire IS ecosystem at these three centers: Hyderabad, Vijayawada and Nellore. The admissions are open, so make sure you are spreading the word so that the students who are interested to prepare for the UPSC examination gets benefit, and that's the reason make sure you're spreading the word, right? So the admissions are open. Now next is L69G4 countries seek urgent reforms of United Nations Security Council. Here we need to understand about the L69G4 and the UNSC grouping, right? Again, this topic is important from the GS2 GS2 as well as prelims. In GS2 we have international relations. Under IR we have this subtopic in the name important international institutions, and which is that institution? United Nations. What is the context? The context is that groupings or groups such as G4, L69 and C10 have or are pushing for reforms in the United Nations Security Council, which means the world has acknowledged or is in the process of acknowledging that it is important to reform the United Nations Security Council to ensure that the UNSC addresses the global challenges the world is facing. Right, and these discussions about reforming the UNSC was discussed in the recent UNGA meeting, right? So let us try to understand first what is this L69 grouping. Why? Because a question can be asked about this L69 grouping in the prelims examination. So make sure you know what is this L69 grouping. L69 group consists of 42 countries from Asia, Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean. Asia, Africa. Now, which are the countries that are part of Latin America? So, Latin America is a grouping that comprises the Southern America, South America, Brazil, Argentina, then the Central America, as well as Mexico, as well as the Caribbean. Right? So, these all countries are part of Latin America, which means this group consists of countries from 42 countries from Asia, Africa, Latin America and Caribbean. Right? It advocates for equitable representation and expansion of UNSC, which means that this grouping contends that UNSC is not representative. Why? Because if you see the United Nations Security Council, United Nations Security Council has 15 members. Out of 15, let's divide this into 5 plus 10, which means 5 are permanent members and 10 are non-permanent members. If I talk about the permanent members, the non-permanent members, it keeps on changing. Permanent members, who are the permanent members? US, UK, France, Russia and China. These are the 5 countries who are the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Now, if we look at these countries, right, UK, France, US, these countries represent the Western Bloc. It represents the Western Bloc. Russia and China. Again, China, Russia, part of Eurasia and China is a part of Asian continent. But if you look at the size of Asia, or let's talk about Latin America, is any one country that is represented in the United Nations Security Council permanent membership? Is there any country represented in the from Africa? No. From Latin America? No. Europe is only represented. The Western countries, they are only represented, but the countries, let's say in Africa, Latin America, they are not represented at all. The countries, if you look at the size of Asia, Asia is underrepresented in the United Nations Security Council. That's the reason L69 advocates for equitable representation and expansion of UNSC, which means L69 wants that the United Nations Security Council should include more members. And why? What is the purpose? So that the UNSC is in a better position to address the global challenges. Which are the global challenges? Climate change, terrorism. These are some of the global challenges that is actually breaking the world. See what's happening in Israel and Gaza. So many people are getting butchered and killed. Russia, Ukraine, the South Asia, Bangladesh, Myanmar. So the condition is very fragile, and that's the reason in order to make the United Nations Security Council is in a position to address the global challenges, UNSC should include more members so that these countries from Africa, countries from Latin America, countries from Asia have a voice in the deliberations and negotiations in the UNSC. It supports the common African position which calls for representation from Africa in the UNSC. Talking about G4, which are the countries that are part of G4? India, Brazil, Germany, India, okay, yeah. So we have India, Brazil, Germany and Japan. These four countries, they aspire for permanent membership in the United Nations Security Council. These four countries believe that they deserve to find their place in the permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council. And they also emphasize that countries that are part of the developing countries, that is the countries from Africa and Latin America, should also be represented in the UNSC. Now, if we talk about G4, or let's talk about India. Now, Brazil is a giant country and deserves a place in the United Nations Security Council. So, of all the four countries, if you see Brazil deserves. Why? Because not a single country from Latin America is represented. If we talk about India, given the size of a country, given the size of our economy, and most importantly, given the way how India has contributed in the United Nations peacekeeping mission. India is the only country that has contributed the maximum number of troops in the UN peacekeeping missions. What is this peacekeeping mission? It is nothing but the military of the United Nations. So whenever the United Nations wants to intervene in any, let's say, civil war, the United Nations needs a military, right? So UN peacekeeping mission, India has contributed significant soldiers in the UNSC peacekeeping missions. So for example, our soldiers sacrifice their lives in many of the missions in the African continent, right? And Japan, given the size of the economy and given the way Japan is a developed nation, these countries deserve a place in the United Nations Security Council, right? So we understood about G69, G4. Now let us try to understand about. So if you look at this image, this is Latin America, Mexico, the Central American, the Caribbean islands, and the Southern America. United Nations Security Council is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations. The responsibility is international peace and security. Now, UNSC, which is one of the 6 principal organs. Which are the other organs? For example, we have the United Nations General Assembly, UNSC, then the United Nations Secretariat, Economic and Social Council, International Court of Justice, Trusteeship Council. So these are the 6 organs, right? It consists of 15 countries. Please do not get confused that UNSC has only 5 countries. No, it has 15 countries. Out of 15 countries, 5 are permanent countries, 10 are non-permanent countries. Which means the non-permanent countries are elected for a 2 years term. So the country that gets elected would have a tenure of 2 years, right? Now the UNSC, when was United Nations established? It got established in the year 1945, that is post the second World War. Now, unfortunately, the United Nations did not reform or refrain from reforming, which means the United Nations Security Council reflects the global realities post the Second World War of the 20th century. It does not reflect the situation of the 21st century, which means it is not in a position to understand the difficulties the world is experiencing in the 21st century. And that's the reason it is a must that the UNSC must change. So, why reforming UNSC is must? One, it lacks representation, which means no country from Africa, Latin America, right? Second, inefficiency and accountability. Now, the existing structure often leads to a situation, particularly due to the veto power held by the P5 countries. What is veto power? Let's say, for example, let's say the world plans to attack Russia, or let's say Russia is a UNSC member. So let me take the example of Iran. The world plans to attack Iran. Why? Because it is proliferating, that is increasing their nuclear arsenal. Now, in order for the world to decide that Iran needs to be attacked, support from 5 countries is must, which means only when the 5 countries, which 5 countries? The P5 countries, US, UK, France, Russia and China. Only if these 5 countries say yes, then Iran will be attacked. Now, given that we are living in a multipolar world where countries are aligning with each other based on these strategic interests, for example, Russia supports Iran. No matter Iran is proliferating or increasing nuclear arsenal or intimidating Israel or Saudi Arabia with nuclear weapons, the world cannot attack Iran. Why the world cannot attack Iran? Because here Russia will use its veto power and stall the resolution. For example, the UNSC, it initiates a resolution thereby intending to attack Iran. Now Russia will use veto power and stall the resolution, will end the resolution. For example, Russia has helped many times India when the United Nations Security Council wanted to condemn India for what India does in Kashmir. The United Nations were of the opinion that the Indian government abuses the human rights of people, right? And that's the reason the World Organization wanted to condemn India or ridicule India, but Russia came to a rescue. They used veto power and defeated the resolution, thereby saving India. Which means the countries based on their strategic interest use the veto power. So it undermines the UNSC's ability to act decisively on global security issues, right? Legitimacy and credibility. Now, given that the United Nations Security Council is not reforming, right? There are talks or somehow the legitimacy and credibility of the United Nations Security Council is getting affected. Why? Because if the world body is not in a position to address solution to the world challenges, it's simple that the importance of the UNSC will diminish. Simple, right? Rising challenges. Same, that given the world is experiencing so many challenges, it is a must that the United Nations Security Council should reform, that is include more number of players, more number of countries and make sure that the UNSC is in a position to reform, right? So, what is the way forward? Initiate text-based negotiation, which means rather than just discussing, make sure that the things that are discussed are put into concrete terms. That is, with respect to what the United Nations Security Council should reform, everything should be text-based, right? The second is support for common African position. That is, to make sure that the African continent is represented. To broaden this support base, engage with a wider range of United Nations member states, especially those who have not taken a clear stand. For example, New Zealand is a country that has not taken any clear stand with respect to whether UNSC should be reformed. So, countries like India, Japan should actually take into confidence the support of countries like New Zealand and make sure that all the countries push for reforms in the UNSC. Leverage multilateral platforms, which means whenever the UNGA meetings are held, right? Whenever the UNGA meetings are held, we need to ensure that the countries are supporting our proposal or resolution, right? We need to take into confidence many countries and make sure that we push the United Nations to ensure that reforms are undertaken, right? And then we also, for example, be it SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS. Now BRICS has been expanded, so we can also leverage the regional organizations to ensure that India gets its support from other countries or from the countries that are yet to take a clear position. This is the way forward. This is how UNSC can be reformed, right? So this was about the second topic on UNSC. So let me take few questions. Yes, Sunil, India is a non-permanent member, which means India is not part of the permanent membership. India is a part of non-permanent member. So we know that UNSC comprises of 15 countries, 5 plus 10. So India is a part of 10 countries, but not a part of permanent membership, right? And that tenure is 2 years. See, the question is why India is not a part of United Nations Security Council. Now, there are rumors stating that India was actually offered the UNSC seat, that is permanent seat. This is only a rumor. There are no official record, Sunil, this is for you. There are no official record indicating that India was offered the UNSC permanent seat. All that we hear on social media is all talks but no action. For that matter, these are all rumors. However, India was not in a position, or India, to put it simply, being a part of UNSC means you need to actually take the responsibility. Being a part of UNSC doesn't mean that you enjoy the benefits or privileges, no. You have to take the responsibility of the world problems. Now, back then in 1947, do you think India was in a position to take the responsibility of the world? India was a poor nation. Food issues, security issues, economy issues. So India was grappling through so many issues. Regionalism. India was in the pursuit to unify the country. Still, India did not complete the process of unification of all the princely states. Junagadh, Hyderabad, Travancore, Hyderabad. So these were the princely states yet to be integrated into India. So our focus was more on to solidify or strengthen our nation. And that's the reason India did not show any interest to to uh, to ask for a permanent seat in the UNSC, right? But again, to put it simply, there are no official records stating that India was offered a permanent seat, right? So let's move on to the last topic of the day. Sponge city concept may mitigate flooding. Flooding is always in the news, right? The flooding problem is devastating the wildlife, the environment, the public infrastructure, people lose their lives. So how can this sponge city concept help in reducing the flooding problem? Mitigate is reduction, reduce. Okay, so let's try to understand this concept of spawn city, and you can mark this for prelims as well as means. In GS paper 3 we have environment and ecology, and you can mark this under GS paper 3. Now, what is the context? Guwahati, right? Now this city has often experienced the problem of flooding. This concept is not only particular with respect to the city of Guwahati, but it is also applicable to the major urban cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Hyderabad, etc. Right? Now, given that these cities actually experience the problem of urban flooding, which actually brings the city to a standstill, right? How can the urban planning adopt innovative measures to mitigate the impact of flooding is something that we are going to understand in the third topic, right? What is sponge city concept? What is sponge? The sponge can actually soak water, right? For example, let's say we want to suck the water from a particular place. We use sponge. We make the sponge wet, that is, we absorb the water in the sponge and then we actually drain it, or we can actually use this water in an area where there is water scarcity. And this is similar to what we understand by the term sponge city concept, right? This is the simplest definition or explanation. Uses natural landscapes, river, lakes, natural landscapes, ponds, green infrastructure to absorb, right, to store water and gradually release water, reducing the impact of floods and improving water availability. Which means whenever there is excessive rain, you either allow the water to permeate, sink into the ground, or store it and use it whenever you require water. This is a holistic approach to deal with the situation of water scarcity or urban flooding. And which are the key elements? Key elements, for example, if you see in the map, yeah, rain. Here we have a green roof building which stores water. Then ultimately the water drains, gets stored or permeates into the ground. So permeable surfaces. So the sponge city concept, it incorporates, that is, it includes the permeable surface, that is surfaces that can help water to sink into the ground. Green roofs, rain gardens and restored wetlands to manage water sustainably. These are the key elements of the sponge city concept. Now, how sponge city concept can mitigate flooding? Let's try to understand. First, it will again say this can be a question asked in the mains examination as well. You can get a 10 marker question. The question can be how the sponge city concept can mitigate or can help in reducing the flooding problem which the major cities of a country are grappling or facing. It converts the urban surfaces, right, into permeable zones, which means we ensure that the urban surfaces are converted into permeable zones, which means, let's say for example, we make a surface or the urban space is converted so that water can actually sink into the groundwater, which means this permeable surface will reduce the surface runoff, right? The second, restoration of natural water systems. Natural water system, we have water bodies, rivers, lakes, right? So we revive, for example, the area where we see that the level of water has gone down, we revive that natural ecosystem or natural water body so that we ensure that there is efficient water drainage system. Green infrastructure, we utilize parks, ponds to slow down and store excess rainwater. So as of now, what happens when there is excessive rain? The water will flow on the streets, which means there is no way for the water to percolate and permeate deep into the ground. This is what we are trying to do with the help of sponge city concept. It helps cities to adapt to extreme weather events by managing water more efficiently, especially in the summer season. We can utilize the stored water and use it in the summer season when the demand for water will be high. And then community involvement, encourage the local community, that is decentralization. Why? Because the local community who are staying there for centuries would have certain innovative idea through which they can ensure that they are in a position to store the water in the ground, or somehow store the water so that they can use it when the demand for water is high. Now again, these are the examples that you should mention. China, China, a developed nation, you see, has implemented green roofs which stores the water, rain gardens and restored wetlands to improve water absorption and reduce flooding. So when there is absorption, when the water is getting absorbed, the runaway or the runoff gets reduced, right? So which leads to reduced flooding. This city has constructed underground reservoirs to store the water and storage tanks to capture and use rain water, right? Then cities like Hamburg in Germany use green infrastructure to manage stormwater and reduce urban flooding. So these are some of the examples that you can see, and please make a note of these examples and make sure that you are incorporating these points in your notes so that whenever you revise for the mains examination, you include all these points, right? Especially the examples. Now, benefits of the sponge city concept for our country. How will India benefit out of this sponge city concept? One, Indian cities like Mumbai, Chennai and so these cities frequently face severe flooding due to heavy monsoons and inadequate drainage system. So what is a drainage system? For example, let's say this is a city and there are certain outlets. You see, there are certain outlets which allows the water to flow. So this is how actually cities are built. But because of the rampant urbanization, the places that were meant for the drainage or for the passage of water outside the city, somehow these places were occupied and construction, the concrete construction was done on these roads you see, right? So because of actually using the public space or the drainage space for urbanization or to build buildings, somehow the drainage system got affected, which means there's no place or no space for the water to flow outside, and that's the reason that leads to urban flooding. So if there's a drainage, the water will flow out. If there's no drainage, the water cannot flow out, and this leads to flooding. And that's the reason by capturing and storing rainwater, the sponge city concept, right, can address the water scarcity. That is, we store the water during the monsoon season and use it during the summer season. And especially this sponge city concept will benefit our country, especially the drought prone regions in Maharashtra and Rajasthan. So again, we can build this underground reservoir that China has built, and we can actually utilize this water in the summer season, right? Green infrastructure filters pollutants. So the pollutants, right? So the green infrastructure, it will filter the pollutant, which means it won't allow the pollutant to permeate into the groundwater. So this is the importance of green infrastructure. Urban heat island effect. Now if you see, because of the extreme concretization using concrete, right, the heat gets trapped in the concrete, right? And as the heat gets trapped, the urban places turn more and more hotter. So because of this green infrastructure, we will reduce the urban heat island effect, right? And then community engagement, that is, we have to involve the local people so that we come up with innovative solutions and measures through which we reduce the impact of flooding, right? So, I guess students, let me just check if I have any questions. Okay. Okay, great. So, I guess we have completed all the three topics that we expected to take in this session, and I hope students you have understood each and every topic, right? Make sure that, as I told you in the beginning, make sure that you are writing down the notes, taking down the notes, and ensuring that you are in a better position to understand each and every topic, so that you can, or these topics will help you in the examination, right? Okay, so I guess we also have a few questions. Yeah, let's also take few questions so that you understand if you understood all the topics or not. The first, the term K-shaped recovery as noted by the World Bank and the NSO office refers to, right? I guess we have referred to what is a K-shaped recovery. Let's try to understand this term. K-shaped recovery, a unique economic recovery across all sectors and income groups. No, this is not what we understood by the term K recovery. Second, a recovery where both the wealthy and the poor experience similar improvements in income levels. The third, a scenario where different segments of the economy recover at different rates, with large businesses and wealthier individuals thriving while the bottom 50% of the population sees minimal income improvement. Self-explanatory, the correct answer is option C. The next, which of the following statements are correct regarding the UNSC? The UNSC has 10 permanent members, each with veto power. Incorrect. The UNSC has 15 members, out of which 5 are permanent members. The second one, the UNSC's primary responsibility is to maintain international peace and security. Exactly. That is the reason they are bestowed with the veto power. The third, the permanent members of the UNSC include US, UK, Germany, and Germany is incorrect, which means first and the third statement are correct. The answer has to be 2 only. Which of the following best describes the spawn city concept? The first, an urban design approach focusing on minimizing the use of water in cities. Second, a concept that utilizes natural landscapes and green infrastructure to manage and absorb rainwater sustainably. See, just we have discussed this topic, so it might be easy for you to address this question, right? But when you actually come across 100 questions, that might actually confuse you, right? So make sure that you are revising the concepts regularly so that you do not go wrong with such type of easy questions. The correct answer is option B. Right, friends? So that's it from our DNA session. I hope you understood all the 5 topics that we have discussed in today's session. I hope you have taken down the notes for all the 3 topics, and make sure, and I also hope that you revise all the concepts that we are discussing on a day-to-day basis. Right, students? So students, if you really appreciate our initiative, make sure that you like, support, and subscribe to Narayana IAS channel. Right? Thank you so much for watching DNA live session. Thank you.